The tragic last days of Rolling Stone Brian Jones.
He was an accident waiting to happen, an overdose waiting to happen.
They've been called the greatest rock and roll band in the world, the Rolling Stones. For nearly 4 decades, they've dominated the music scene. But if not for a young musician named Brian Jones, the Rolling Stones may never have existed. He co-founded the band, and throughout the 60s was the driving force behind the group, pushing the Stones into uncharted musical regions. But in July 1969, Brian Jones' voyage came to an end. He was found dead, floating in a swimming pool, the victim of an apparent drowning accident. Or was it?
He was a very good swimmer. You know, how could he have drowned in his own swimming pool?
It seemed to be what was to become a classic rock and roll death, but looks can be deceiving.
For over 30 years, the mysterious death of Brian Jones has been the subject of rumor and innuendo. What really happened that night in July 1969? Was Brian Jones the victim of a tragic accident or foul play? In the beginning, the Rolling Stones were a group of young English musicians with a fanatical love for American rhythm and blues.
It was quite clear at the very beginning that he was the leader of the band. I mean, he started the band. It was through his efforts and his energy that the band existed.
Pat Andrews was Brian's girlfriend just as he was starting his career. She also gave birth to his son.
Brian worked very hard to get together a band of musicians who felt the same way that he did. It had the same love of blues and jazz. The thing about Brian that I would remember the most was his determination to reach his goal at all costs.
The hard work and sacrifice paid off. The Stones made it to the top of the charts, providing a gritty counterpoint to the wholesome image of their rivals, the Beatles. During that time, Brian helped define the look as well as the sound of the Stones. In many ways, he was the heartthrob of the group.
The first thing that struck me about Brian was that he had the most refined and developed image of all of them. He had an extraordinary look. His hair was remarkable. His looks were sort of pretty stroke ugly.
But Brian Jones was more than just a rock and roll pretty boy. He was an amazingly versatile and talented musician.
I was staggered by his musical ability. It was extraordinary being with him in the recording studio because he could play almost any instrument that was given to him. I mean, whether it was a flute or a guitar or keyboards or any percussion instrument or curious stringed instrument from North Africa, he seemed to be able to play it and to make it work.
However, Brian was not able to write the pop songs that would become hits. With Mick Jagger and Keith Richards taking center stage as the chief songwriters for the Stones, Brian found himself relegated to the role of sideman and lost himself in a drug-induced haze.
He was an accident waiting to happen, an overdose waiting to happen. And I mean, I saw him, you know, in the most terrible states in recording studios and on tour.
In 1969, the Stones released their seminal album, Beggar's Banquet, featuring Sympathy for the Devil. But as the band prepared for their biggest U.S. tour yet, they quickly realized that Brian would not be able to handle the rigors of the road.
He was barely able to function, and the Stones just couldn't work with him. They knew he wasn't going to work on the tour.
I think that it got to a point where they simply couldn't carry him anymore. From Brian's point of view, it must have been ghastly. It must have been absolutely awful for him. But I don't know how anyone else could have really helped him.
Brian Jones withdrew to his country estate, Cotchford Farm. There, he set about restoring the mansion and getting his life back on track.
He became what was later to be the model of the rock and roll country squire, and hooked up with a Swedish 19-year-old named Anna Wolin, who moved in with him into the estate at that point, and he retreated from the Stones.
Then, on July 3rd, 1969, Brian's idyllic country fantasy came crashing down. At the age of 27, he was found dead in his swimming pool. His former girlfriend, Pat Andrews, recalls that fateful day.
She said, "Brian's dead." And I said, "Brian's dead?" I said, no. She said, "It was on the news. He drowned."
I think it shocked everybody in the music business. It was a very sad, moving, distressing thing. It was a horrible end to the decade, really. It was very sad, very moving, very upsetting.
According to the police report, Brian had gone swimming around 10:30 p.m. on the night of July 2nd with his girlfriend, Anna Wolin, and another couple. At one point, Anna and the couple went back into the house, leaving Brian alone. Shortly after, they claimed to have found Brian floating face down in 6 feet of water. Most people assumed that Brian Jones had simply overdosed on drugs and alcohol. An autopsy, however, revealed that there was not a high enough level of alcohol or drugs in his system to have caused a fatal overdose.
The assumption was that he had died as a result of some sort of overdose. So when the news came out, there was some doubt as to what he'd ingested and how he had died. I think I and a lot of other people were quite surprised.
The coroner ruled that Brian Jones had died as a result of immersion in fresh water under the influence of drugs and alcohol. He characterized the incident as death by misadventure. That is, accidental death not due to crime or negligence. But from the beginning, there were rumors that there may have been a far more sinister explanation.
There was no reason for him to sink to the bottom of that pool. And Keith and Mick knew this. The Stones knew this. And Keith later on would say in his own autobiography that he knew that murder had occurred that night at the Cochford Farm.
When VH1 Confidential returns, was Brian Jones's death an accident or murder?
A man had jumped on his back, and there was a vicious fight in the pool where they were holding Brian down underneath the water.
Early on the morning of July 3rd, 1969, Rolling Stones guitarist Brian Jones was found dead in the swimming pool at his country estate. According to the police report, his girlfriend and another couple had discovered him floating face down in 6 feet of water. Investigators ruled his death an accidental drowning, but many people suspected foul play. Since his death, at least 2 accounts of what occurred that night have been advanced. Both differ from the official police report, and both versions center on tensions between Brian and some local men employed at his country manor.
He hired a bunch of workers to restore the house, which was his pride and joy. And these workers took advantage of Brian and would steal everything that wasn't nailed down in the house. They would rifle his drugs, they would steal his towels, they stole his liquor. The lead worker was a gentleman by the name of Frank Thorogood, who was 45 years old and, by all accounts, a brutish thug of a man who took advantage of everything that Brian did, saw his weak spots, and was able to rip him off and double bill him.
Mark Grubert believes that the tensions between Brian and the workers were exacerbated by jealousy.
Girls loved Brian Jones. I mean, every girl loved him, and every guy hated him. These guys were hardcore blue-collar English country workers, and it didn't go over well with them. And he would taunt them about how they were living a meaningless existence, they were merely carpenters, and he was a great rock star. And they didn't take this too well. So every night they would get drunk and taunt him, and he would taunt them back. And they would end up in fistfights.
According to one alleged eyewitness, that taunting turned deadly on the night of July 2nd. In his book, The Inside Story of the Original Rolling Stone, journalist Nicholas Fitzgerald recalled that he and a friend had gone to the mansion that evening. There, they stumbled upon a shocking scene.
He claims there were about 8 or 10 people partying, guys and girls, and that the guys from the crew were taunting Brian Jones. And a man had jumped on his back, and there was a vicious fight in the pool where they were holding Brian down underneath the water. Nicholas Fitzgerald was in the woods apparently watching this scene unfold at poolside, and according to Fitzgerald, he was grabbed from behind, and they said to him, "If you say anything about this, you'll be next."
According to Fitzgerald, Brian had been killed by a gang of roughnecks. But one witness who was definitely there that night says that this is not what happened. In a recent book, The Murder of Brian Jones, his former girlfriend, Anna Wolin, claims that Brian was murdered by Frank Thorogood, the foreman of the workmen, acting alone.
The incident, as Anna Wolin records it, is quite different from Fitzgerald's recollection of it, and quite different from everyone else's recollection. Anna Wolin says that it was her, Frank Thorogood, Brian Jones, and Frank Thorogood's mistress who were there at the house that night. No other people, just the 4 of them.
Anna Wolin says that the simmering animosity between Brian and Thorogood came to a head after Brian decided to fire him. According to Anna, Brian invited Thorogood and his girlfriend over to the house that night to discuss the situation.
And apparently Frank Thorogood knew that his time had come, that this was his day of reckoning, that he had indeed been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. To say Thorogood was pissed is an understatement. I mean, he was furious.
According to Anna, they talked for a while, then went out to the pool for a swim. She returned to the house to take a phone call, leaving Brian alone with Thorogood and his girlfriend. A few minutes later, Anna heard the girlfriend screaming for help.
She comes running down the stairs and sees Frank Thorogood with a towel around his neck, his hand shaking, trying to light a cigarette in the kitchen. She runs out to the pool and sees Brian lying on the bottom of the pool at night, floating eerily face down. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. Why doesn't anybody help him? Why doesn't anybody help him? She runs in and grabs Frank and she says, "Why didn't you save him? Why didn't you do something?" Frank says absolutely nothing to her, stands there trying to light the cigarette, his hand shaking like a leaf. She drags him out to the pool, and the 2 of them go into the water and fish out his body, which is still warm. This is literally moments later, to no avail. Brian's gone. She's screaming at Frank, "You killed him, you killed him." He clams up, doesn't say a word. He's stone cold, clammed up, and she knew in her heart that he killed him. When the police showed up, Thorogood told her to just say that she came downstairs and saw Brian at the bottom of the pool. As simple as that.
Anna Wolin says she kept silent out of fear, but she has from the beginning believed that Brian Jones died at the hands of Frank Thorogood, and there may be proof to back up her version. According to several published accounts, Thorogood made a deathbed confession to his friend Tom Keelock, who was a road manager for the Rolling Stones at the time of Jones's death. Keelock quoted Thorogood as telling him in the hospital, "It was me that did Brian. I just finally snapped. It just happened. That's all there is to it."
At that point, he passed away, and that's where the case was left. The police briefly reopened the case, but all parties had passed on at that point. There was no point in prosecuting the case any further.
Thorogood's family has disputed the supposed confession. They assert that Frank Thorogood was incapable of homicide. What really happened that night in 1969? Did Brian Jones accidentally drown in his own swimming pool, or was he murdered? Despite Thorogood's alleged confession, many people who knew Brian Jones do not believe he was deliberately killed.
I still don't think he was murdered. I think there might have been other people involved in his death, but I don't think he was murdered.
3 decades later, the truth behind the death of Brian Jones is as murky as ever. The tragic drowning of this musical pioneer remains one of rock and roll's greatest unsolved mysteries.
I feel that it would be so nice if Brian's death could be investigated once and for all, and then everybody could be at rest, including Brian, because I think probably the most unfair thing that happened to Brian was the fact that his death was not properly investigated.